For this lecture, I'm going to cover hypothesis and hypothesis testing. And because you're getting ready to discuss analysis and findings section of your research paper, it is important to review a few of the main components of your research. First, let's review the population, which is the larger whole group from which you sampled. You may have used a method of inviting people to participate in your study through convenience sample, stratified sample, or snowball sampling. The sample are those who received the invitation to participate, and the participants are those who were invited that actually chose to participate and completed the survey activity. Whether the survey or participated in a treatment of some kind, whoever actually participated are the ones who we call participants. When reporting about the population sample and the participants in your study, it's important that you recognize the difference and the power of language when describing them, to making sure you understand the difference between population, sample, and actual participants. Some students get confused about the sample and the participants. The sample, again, the people you invited, the participants, the ones who actually participated. It's also important to understand sampling error. So although our level of research will not include calculating the sampling error, it's important to actually recognize that it exists. So sampling error occurs when the measures of distribution, the mean, the mode, the median for the sample, do not match that of the population. So if you take a sample of the population, you randomly sample the population, that mean, mode, and median should be very, very similar to the population. The sample should be similar to the population as a whole. So when there's low sampling error and the sample accurately represents the population, then the results of your study may claim a higher degree of generalizability from the sample to the public. So for example, in our resiliency and stress data regarding social work students, most of the students took the survey. However, if we had randomly selected 30% of the seniors to take the survey, the results should match the data that we've been examining. So if we only took 30%, we tested the whole population, and then we took 30% of the students, those randomly selected 30%, the scores of the 30% should match the whole population. And then we could say that it would have high generalizability. So returning back to the null and alternative hypothesis, remember that the null hypothesis are those statements that report there is no difference or there's no relationship, and the alternative hypothesis is your guess, what you think is going to happen. It's your hypothesis that there is a difference or there is a relationship. So prior to looking at the data and arriving at the results, it is helpful to review the hypothesis, null, and the alternative. So as a broad overview of steps, remember what type of statistics that will be used, excuse me, run those descriptive or inferential statistics, find the results, and then based off the results, you will accept or reject the null hypothesis or answer the research question depending on whether you had a null or alternative hypothesis. You do this for each of your hypotheses. Now let's go back and look at them one at a time. So overall, you're going to look at all the hypotheses and the results, and you're going to see if you accept or reject the null hypothesis. So these are the hypotheses that we had for the Rahe stress scale and the relationship between them. One are descriptive. A majority of senior social work research students will fall within the moderate Holmes and Rahe stress scale. So their scores, we we hypothesized, we guessed that most of them will fall in 151 to 299. The comparative would be there is no difference in resilience total between the various senior social work students' age groups. In the last hypothesis, a correlation, there is no relationship between the resilience total and the Holmes and Rahe stress scale scores for senior social work students. So looking at these three hypotheses is what we had for our study that you've been working on in Excel. Looking at them one at a time, let's look at the type of statistical analysis we're going to do. For the descriptive, all we can do is frequency, percentages, and measures of central tendency at times. For the comparative, because we have interval level data that could have an absolute 0, we are going to use a t-test, which looks at p-values, and the p-value for the test for a previous year was 0.023. And if you do a correlation, is there a relationship between the stress scale and the resiliency scores? You do a Pearson R. If you remember, you already have done those. And here is the p-value of 0.56. And that's a p-value for previous data from a different year. So for the alternative hypothesis that we had, a majority of senior social work students will fall within the moderate Holmes and Rahe stress scale scores of 151 to 299. This is a directional prediction. We're predicting that these scores are going to fall into a specific place. This is categorical data because it falls into a category. And we are going to use descriptive statistical analysis. You can see here, for a previous year, we have put them into their bins. So you have one person in 11 to 150, 151 to 299. We have 10 people. Then we have 6 in the 300 to 600 and 2 in the 600 plus. And now we have the percentages and can easily see that our alternative hypothesis is accepted because our guess was correct. So this is alternative hypothesis, and we are going to accept the alternative and reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis on comparative. So our null said there's no difference in resilience between the various social work students' age groups. Remember, we have age groups of 18 to 25, 26 to 35, and 36 and above. So the resilience total is interval level data, and therefore we can run inferential statistics. So to show you the two types of inferential statistics we can run for comparative null hypotheses, I have examined the data using both 2 groups and 3 groups. When you have 2 groups, you can utilize a t-test. In this case, I used the 18 to 25-year-olds and the 26-year-olds as the 2 groups that I ran a test to see if there was a difference between their scores. The second inferential statistic test that I ran was the ANOVA, which is the analysis of variance. It examines how values in 3 age groups, so 3 or more groups, compares with one another in terms of our test as the resilience total. So let's examine how to determine whether we will accept or reject the null hypothesis based on the p-value. So for most social work science research, we utilize a p is less than 0.05 to determine if something is statistically significantly different. So after running the inferential statistics, both for the t-test and the ANOVA, it was found that both p-values were more than 0.05. So you can see one for the ANOVA is 0.83, and the comparative on the t-test was 0.95, well above the 0.05 cutoff. And because the value was above our 0.05, we would accept the null hypothesis that there is no difference between the various groups. Had the p-value been 0.02 or anything like that, then we would have to reject the null and accept our hypothesis that there was a difference between groups. Finally, let's look at how we might answer the correlational null hypothesis. And that one was there is no relationship between resilience total and Holmes and Rahe stress scale scores for senior social work students. The resilience total and the Holmes and Rahe stress scale scores are interval level data, and therefore we can run inferential statistics. Earlier in the semester, you learned how to run a Pearson R test and evaluate the R squared for the coefficient determination. For this lecture, let's examine how to determine whether we accept or reject the null hypothesis based on the Pearson R. After running the inferential statistics, it was found that R equals 0.27, which, according to the textbook, indicates a weak relationship between the resilience total and the Holmes and Rahe stress scale scores. Therefore, we will accept the null hypothesis that reports there is no significant relationship between the resilience total and the HRSS scores for senior social work students. To say that there was a relationship, you'd want at least a moderate to strong relationship. So if that R value did reveal a moderate, strong, or very strong relationship, then you would reject the null hypothesis. Finally, a review for reporting on accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. Accept the null if there was no statistical significant difference or relationship. So accept the null if p is higher than 0.05. Reject the null if there was a statistical significant difference or relationship. P is 0.05 is less than 0.05. We will cover the p-values in a later lecture. So great job sticking with this content. Sometimes it can take a few times of hearing it to finally grasp all the implications, but keep up the great work.